If you're new with us, we're in a study through the Gospel of Mark as a church. It's a series we're calling Follow Me. Follow Me. This morning we come to Mark chapter 9. If you have your Bibles, please pull them out with me and turn to Mark chapter 9. If you don't have a Bible and would like to use one that's provided there, you'll find a number of Bibles in the seat backs in front of you. So feel free to use one of those. If you do, this morning's passage is found on page 844. Page 844. I'm going to go ahead and read our passage straightway through, and then we'll circle back and just dive in together and work through it bit by bit. Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 29. Follow along as I read. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, that is Jesus, they were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" And someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And he answered them, "Oh, faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him. And when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground, and he rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it has often cast him into the fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for the one who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe. Help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." Faith is important for everyday life, isn't it? Faith is so important. I recently, as you know, flew to the jungles of Peru for the Tucson Bible dedication. And getting to our destination involved 5 different airplanes. Have you ever thought about how much faith it takes to get on an airplane? I mean, getting on an airplane means you have to trust a pilot that you've never met and sit down in a machine that you have never inspected and depend on an entire air traffic control system that keeps your plane from colliding with other planes. If you stop and think about it, it's amazing that any of us get on any plane, right? It takes a lot of faith. And so we had to fly from Tucson to Dallas, and then another plane from Dallas to Miami, and then another plane from Miami over to Lima, Peru, and then we went from Lima on a smaller plane to a city called Iquitos, and then we got into a very small Cessna to fly from Iquitos to Caxiacocha, where the Andersons live. And I'm telling you, as the planes got smaller and smaller and smaller on this journey, it's like dawning on me how much faith you put into this pilot and this machine that's hurling you through the air, right? Life involves faith at every level. For instance, you have to trust that other cars are going to stay in their lane on the highway. You've got to believe that the email you send your colleague is actually going to arrive in their inbox. You have to trust every restaurant that you visit to prepare the food safely. You have to trust your friends to keep your confidences. On and on we could go. Life requires faith at every turn. And because that's true, it's not surprising to realize that faith is also essential for the Christian life. Faith is essential for the Christian life. And here's what I want you to see this morning. Jesus calls each of us today to greater faith in him. Did you notice in the story as we read it that Jesus is just calling everybody around him in the story to greater faith in him? And so as we look at the story together this morning, I hope each of us will see that no matter where you are in your relationship with God today, Jesus is calling you to greater faith, even greater faith in him. Well, let's look at the story in three parts. We're going to see the problem of unbelief in verses 14 through 19, and then the call to greater faith in verses 20 through 27, and then we'll look at the connection between faith and prayer in verses 28 through 29. Those 3 points. So first, number one, the problem of unbelief. The problem of unbelief. We see that in verses 14 through 19. As we dive into the story, remember that where Jesus has been. Jesus, Peter, James, and John have just been up on that high mountain where he was transfigured before them. Do you remember? Now they're coming down to see what the other 9 disciples have been up to. Here's the thing. It reminds us of the story of Moses. Remember when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai after basking in the glory of God, he finds the people of Israel down below engaging in idolatry and revelry. In a similar way, here we have Jesus, Peter, James, and John coming down from this glorious mountain only to find the other 9 disciples embroiled in controversy. So look again, verse 14. When they, that is Jesus, Peter, James, and John, came to the disciples, the other 9 disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw Jesus, they were greatly amazed, and they ran up to him and they greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" And someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." They were not able. It's a chaotic situation, I'm sure you would agree. First of all, you have this father. This father whose son is experiencing severe epileptic seizures, not to mention the fact that he's also deaf and mute. And this father apparently attributes these symptoms going on with his son to demonic oppression. He says, "My boy is being demonized." Now, here's the thing we need to understand. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes the Bible links together physical sickness with demonic attack. That link is not always there. Just because you're sick doesn't mean you're being demonically attacked. But there are cases in the Bible where the two are linked, and this is one of those cases. And so the father brings the boy to the disciples, and here's the problem. According to verse 18, the disciples, we read, are not able to cast the demon out. Now you might say, why is that such a grave problem? Why is that such an embarrassing problem, really? Well, here's why. Remember that earlier in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus had explicitly given authority to his apostles to cast out demons. In fact, do you remember this? Jesus sends the apostles out and tells them to go preach the gospel, heal people, and cast out demons. And they go out and they cast out many demons, we're told. And they come back and they tell Jesus all about it. So this is their specialty. This is the thing they're supposed to be able to do. But Here they can't cast this demon out, apparently. They're helpless. Why? Why can't they cast out this demon? Well, judging by Jesus' next statement in the text, apparently these 9 disciples at the base of the mountain had become self-assured. They had become overly confident about their abilities here. They were depending on their own strength rather than depending on the power of God. In other words, these 9 disciples lacked faith. They lacked faith, didn't they? And so Jesus calls them out on it. Verse 19, look what he says there. And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring the boy to me." The key word in Jesus' rebuke is faithless, right? Faithless. They're without faith. This is a faithless generation, he says. This generation lacks faith. This is a people who struggles with the problem of unbelief. That's the idea. Faithless generation. But let me ask you a question. Who exactly is Jesus critiquing when he says, "Oh, faithless generation"? Who's he talking about? You know, there's great disagreement on this as you read the commentaries. Some say Jesus is critiquing especially the scribes. After all, they were the ones that were arguing with the disciples at the bottom of that mountain, and they're so often opposed to Jesus. They certainly lack faith. Other people say, no, what Jesus is critiquing in that statement there is he's critiquing the disciples. After all, the disciples have been given authority to cast out demons, but they can't cast this demon out. Therefore, they need faith. So this is a critique against them. Other people you read say, no, actually, Jesus' statement here is aimed at the father in the story, because after all, this father in the story, later on in the story, will tell us he needs help with his unbelief. So Jesus must be critiquing him. Still, other people say this is a critique of the crowds. I mean, Jesus says you're a faithless generation after all, so this is describing all the people standing there. He seems to be describing a large group. Well, here's the thing. I don't think we have to choose between these options. Take note of the fact that everyone in this story is faithless to some degree. Everyone in the story faces the same problem. You say, what problem is that? It's the problem of unbelief. And that's important for us to see this morning, because unbelief is a universal human problem. It's not just a you problem, it's not just a me problem, it's an everybody problem. The problem of unbelief, and everybody in the story faces it. In fact, if you really think about it, unbelief is the root cause of every other sin that we face. Unbelief, I would argue, is the root cause of every other sin that gets expressed by you and I. Think about it for a second. What is, for instance, sexual immorality of any kind? What is sexual immorality? Well, it's really a failure to believe that God's guidelines for our sexual expression are good. Another example, what is idolatry at its roots? Well, idolatry is failure to believe that only God can satisfy our soul. Come to think of it, what is greed? Well, greed is a failure to believe that God's provision is enough. What is revenge? Revenge is failure to believe that God is the ultimate judge. On and on we could go. At the root, we could trace any sin back to its root cause. And what do you find at rock bottom? You find unbelief. That's the problem. Why did Adam and Eve, come to think of it? Why did they eat that fruit in the garden? Because they failed to believe that God was good. Unbelief is a universal problem, a human problem, and the root cause of every other sin. And when we read this morning's story, and we see that everybody around Jesus in this story is struggling with unbelief, the challenge is for you and I to read ourselves into this story too, and realize unbelief is our problem too, isn't it? Brothers and sisters, do you realize that your heart is prone to unbelief. Well, there's hope in this scene at this point in the story as well, because let me ask you this. Did you notice that there's only one person in the scene who does not lack faith? And who is that? It's Jesus, isn't it? Jesus is the one person in this scene who doesn't lack faith. And Jesus says in verse 19, notice, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you?" In stating it that way, Jesus is setting himself apart from the faithless generation. So you've got the faithless generation over here, and Jesus sets himself apart over there. Jesus' statement here would be arrogant unless he really is a model of perfect faith. Only someone with perfect faith could say such a thing. And because Jesus is a perfect example of faith, that means he can call us to higher faith as well. So we've seen the problem of unbelief. Notice next the call to greater faith. The call to greater faith in verses 20 through 27. So Jesus asks for the boy to be brought to him, and it becomes immediately obvious that the boy is, in fact, severely demonized. So his father's diagnosis is correct. This is a demonic problem here. And so we pick it up at verse 20. Look there. "And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the father, 'How long has this been happening to him?' And he said, 'From childhood, and it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us.'" It's not hard to feel completely overwhelmed for this father in the story, is it? There's those of you who are parents and grandparents, you know there's just nothing quite as painful as watching your own child suffer. And in this case, rubbing salt in the wound is the fact that this boy is suffering because of demonic torment, a demon that's literally trying to kill the boy, throw him into fire, throw him into water. And so the father cries out to Jesus for help. Can we blame him? Verse 22, he says, "If you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." But here's the thing. There's something off about the father's request. Did you notice it? There's something a little wrong with and a little off about the father's request of Jesus. Notice what he says to Jesus. He says, "If you can do anything, would you heal my son? If you're able, could you come to our rescue?" Baked into this man's plea is a subtle doubt that Jesus has the ability to heal his son. And Jesus picks up on this. And Jesus calls this man to greater faith there in verse 23. Jesus says, 23, Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." All things are possible for one who believes. Let's sit on that phrase. What is Jesus driving at? What's he saying? He's saying it's not a matter of what Jesus is able to do. No, Jesus has infinite power to help. And faith should connect this man to that infinite power. All things are possible because all things are possible for Jesus. And faith connects you to him. Commentator James Edward puts it this way, quote, he says, "The sole bridge between frail humanity and the all-sufficiency of God is faith." All things are possible for the one who believes. So Jesus is not putting the emphasis on faith per se, okay? Jesus is not saying, if you can just have the right kind of faith or just enough faith, then you can do the impossible. He's not preaching like faith healers would. If you just believe enough, then God has to answer. That's not Jesus' emphasis here. No, Jesus is putting the emphasis on his own unlimited power to do anything that he wants to do. We could state it another way. You only needed the tiniest bit of faith to get connected to the infinite power of Jesus. That's the point. All things are possible for the one who believes. So if I could use that airplane example that I used before, it's important to have some faith to get on the plane, but what really matters is the airplane, right? The competency of the pilot, the safety of that machine, the ability of it to take flight. So small faith connects you to something enormous, right? On the flip side, what if the plane is sound and the flight path is secure and the weather is perfect and the pilot is skilled and your destination awaits you, but you're too scared to step on the plane because you doubt its ability to fly? Well, that's a problem, right? This is where the father in this story is. He wants Jesus' help, but he struggles to believe that Jesus can help. He struggles to believe that Jesus is able. And so Jesus calls him up to greater faith in himself. Here's the thing. Whether this man's request is answered or not, he must believe that Jesus is able to do whatever he wants. Whether this man's request is answered or not, the challenge is for this man to believe that Jesus is able and competent and powerful and almighty enough to do whatever he wants. And friends, that is a lesson for us today. Faith that pleases God is the kind of faith that believes God is able, believes God is powerful, believes God is omnipotent, whether he says yes or no to our requests or not. It's a faith that says, God, whether you say yes to my prayer or whether you say no to my prayer, either way, I believe you can. I believe you're able. I believe you're infinite in your power and your authority. If you say no to my prayer request, there must be a reason. And if you say yes to my prayer request, it's all of grace. But either way, I believe, God, you can do whatever you want because you're omnipotent. That's the kind of faith that pleases God. So I wonder, brothers and sisters, what are you praying for today? As you put yourself into the shoes of the father in the story, what are you praying for today? The kind of faith that pleases God is the kind that says, God, in my praying, in my requesting, I really believe you are able to do whatever you want to do. All things are possible with you. And so I just leave results with you, whether you say yes or no. Maybe you're here today and you're praying for healing because of some physical suffering that you're going through. While you pray, let your mind go to that thought that God is infinite in his power and his ability. Whether he heals you physically or not, trust in his almighty power. Maybe you're here and you're praying for someone close to you. Maybe you're praying for a prodigal son or daughter to come home. If that's you today, I know it's many of you in this place. As you pray, remember, God is able. God is able. He is able to change the heart of your wandering son or daughter and bring them back. Remember that theological fact, even as you trust him with the timeline of answering that request or not. Are you fighting today against sin? Brothers, sisters, believe that God can give you victory. Believe that he is all-powerful in that, and keep on seeking him. Faith that pleases God is the kind of faith that believes God is able. Whether he says yes, and sometimes when he says no. And Jesus calls this man to greater faith, doesn't he? A faith that rests in the omnipotence of Christ. That's what he calls him to. And the man responds to Jesus' call. The man steps up, right? Look what he says in response to Jesus there in verse 24. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. I love that statement, don't you? What an encouraging, gritty thing to say. The man's cry here is like a perfectly balanced statement of honest trust. On the one hand, he says, Lord, I believe. He expresses a willing, resolved determination to trust Jesus, even in spite of all of his question marks. On the other hand, he says, help my unbelief. It's a humble admission that his faith is weak, and he needs Jesus to give him the very faith that Jesus requires of him. So this statement, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, it's like two sides of the same coin. On the one side is the resolve to trust. Lord, I believe. On the other side is the admission of weakness and the need for faith that only God can supply. Help my unbelief. Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. Friends, I wonder this morning, can you pray this prayer in your life? Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. Help my unbelief. Sometimes I think we are afraid in Christian circles to admit that we have a problem with unbelief. Sometimes I think in Christian circles we're afraid to admit that we struggle with our faith sometimes. I had a professor in college who said to me, Eric, as you look around at Christians sitting in the pews, as it were, you need to realize that most Christians at some level are closet doubters. Closet doubters at some level. I think that's probably pretty accurate. We wrestle with our question marks about God and faith and life, don't we? We're terrified that anyone would find out about our faith weaknesses. But here in the story, this man's prayer is a great example of taking those doubts out of hiding and bringing them to God and fighting to believe even as you struggle to believe. I think this man's prayer in the text is a practical help and a guide for each and every one of us. Because each of us struggles with unbelief, and each of us is called by Jesus to even greater faith. So are you a college student this morning who perhaps is wrestling with doubts about the Christianity that you were raised in? If that's you this morning, you can pray this prayer, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. Do you find yourself in a crisis, struggling to trust that God is good? You can pray this prayer, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. Are you going through a dark night of the soul, perhaps? God seems distant. You can't even figure out why. You can pray this prayer, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. Maybe you're here this morning, you're not even a Christian yet. And you know the gospel message that Christ died for sinners like you, that you must put your faith, your trust in him for forgiveness, to be made right with God, to have eternal life. But you're so plagued by so many questions that you haven't taken that step. If that's you this morning, you can admit your struggle to believe to God. And you can ask God to give you the very faith that he requires of you. You can pray like the man in the story, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. So listen, whether you're here this morning and you're a seeker or a brand new believer or you are a seasoned saint, I believe Jesus is calling each one of us this morning to greater faith in him, and you can claim this man's prayer in the story as your own. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. In a room like this, who knows how many situations each and every one of us are going through. But you can take this prayer and just plug it in to your situation and express your humble, gritty, honest faith to God. Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. Now, in the story, Jesus answers this man's prayer in two ways, okay? On the one hand, he heals the man's son, but on the other hand, he also helps the man with his unbelief in answer to his request. So look what happens, verse 25. Look there. When Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out. And the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. Jesus wants to avoid publicity, as we've seen before. And so when he sees all the crowds are really beginning to gather up now, he gets right to work. He commands the demon to be gone, and the demon convulses the boy and then leaves. And apparently this whole thing was so violent that the boy ends up lying there looking dead. And Jesus takes the boy then by the hand, raises him up to his feet. Interestingly, the language there in verse 27 is the language of resurrection. We might translate that verse, Jesus raised him and he was resurrected. It's very similar language to back when Jesus raised that little girl back to life. Remember Jairus' daughter? Same language used there. So here's the thing. Either this boy really was dead, and so here we see a second miracle, and Jesus raises him back to life, or the boy appeared dead, and Jesus is simply reviving him. But either way that you interpret this section, either way, this is a picture of Jesus' resurrection power, isn't it? And this is a foreshadowing of the fact that Jesus himself will die and be raised. So remember what the Father asked. He said, Jesus, help my unbelief. And what does Jesus give him? Jesus here is helping this man's unbelief by showing him a vivid picture of Jesus' resurrection power. Brothers and sisters, one of the greatest ways that you can strengthen your faith is to behold the resurrection power of Jesus Christ. I urge you to consider the evidence for the historical bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ as recorded in the gospel accounts, as recorded in the scriptures. As you consider the strong evidence for his resurrection, God will strengthen your faith. And then on the other hand, I encourage you just to notice Jesus' resurrection power in the lives of Christians around you. When you see lives that have been transformed by Christ, it should strengthen your faith, just like this father's faith is strengthened as he watches his son raised back up. Listen, the Christian sitting next to you that you think to yourself, they are such a godly man or such a godly woman. Guess what? You should have seen them before they came to Christ. The reason they are the way they are now is because of the transforming, powerful resurrection life of Jesus. And so as you look at their transformed life, may it strengthen your faith. We've seen the problem of unbelief. We've heard the call to greater faith. Notice finally the connection between faith and prayer. The connection between faith and prayer. Look again at verse 28. When he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. Understandably, the disciples are a bit humiliated from this story, aren't they? They had been given authority over demons by Jesus, but now they had become a public spectacle of failure. And so they wonder, what did we do wrong? Where did we go wrong? They pulled Jesus aside in private to ask the question, what went wrong? Why couldn't we cast it out? Notice that their question betrays their problem. They say, why couldn't we cast it out? Why couldn't we cast it out? In other words, they were thinking all about their own ability to cast it out. In the ancient world, exorcisms were all about techniques. It was all about certain incantations, naming certain names, performing certain exorcism techniques in order to get a demon out. And so the disciples were apparently thinking that there must be something wrong with their technique. They think it's all about their own ability to cast out a demon by getting their methods right. But Jesus says, no, it's actually, guys, not about your technique and it's not about your abilities. Ultimately, this thing is all about the power of God. It's all about the omnipotence of God. He says this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. Why does he mention prayer? Here's why. Because prayer connects you to the power of God. Prayer is an expression of your faith that God's power, not your own power, God's power can cast out a demon or do whatever God calls you to do. Faith connects you to God's power. There's a deep connection between prayer and faith. Prayer is like a declaration of your faith. Think about it. When you pray, to the world it looks really foolish, like we're just whistling into the wind, like you're just like saying a bunch of words out into the outer space. But when we pray, it's a declaration of our faith. It's saying, God, I believe that these words that I'm saying to a God I can't see with my eyes, I believe that these words are really going up to your throne. I believe that you really are a powerful God. I believe that you really are my only source of true help. It's a declaration of faith. Brothers and sisters, do you pray? Do you pray? Your life of prayer speaks volumes about the strength of your faith. How you pray shows us how you believe. Do you want to grow in your faith this morning? Then grow in your ability to pray. Prayer is kind of like an extension cord connecting your faith to the power of God. I like to work in my garage from time to time. I have a number of power tools. Nothing fancy, but everybody who uses power tools knows you got to be careful with these big, powerful tools. There's nothing worse than when you get everything set up with your chop saw, your miter saw, all ready to go. You've triple checked all the safety features. You've got the handle up, you've got the wood marked, you've got it slid underneath, you've looked and everything's ready. Take a deep breath, reach up to the handle of this powerful saw, push the button and begin to push down, and nothing happens. You're like, You look over to the wall and realize the extension cord wasn't plugged into the wall. Those of you who are laughing have been there 1,000 times, right? It's painful. And you realize the reason that it's unplugged is because you just unplugged it for safety measure. I don't care how powerful that tool really is, it can't access that power unless it's plugged in. You need that extension cord to be plugged in, and prayer is the extension cord between our faith in our God and the omnipotence of our God. And Jesus wants his disciples here and wants us to realize they could never cast a demon out like this without prayer, because prayer expresses their dependence upon God, and because only God can cast out a demon like this one. Commentator Mark Strauss puts it well. He says, we can accomplish anything when we acknowledge that we can accomplish nothing on our own. Mustard seed faith is a little bit of faith in a very big God. And so, brothers and sisters, this week, when you face challenges, large and small, you must pray. You must pray. In any situation you face, plug in the extension cord. Link your faith with the power of your God. In any and every situation that you face, in any trial that you're going through, you must pray. And we can pray, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. That's a great prayer you could pray on Monday morning. And when you pray like that, your feeble faith gets plugged into and connected to a very big God. Faith is important. I'm sure you would agree. Faith is necessary for all of life, and faith is essential for the Christian life. As we've seen from our passage, we all struggle with unbelief, and therefore we've all got room to grow when it comes to our faith. My daughter's middle school track coach gave the students some great advice the other day. She said to the student athletes, when you come to practice, try to be just 1% better than you were the practice before. Not 10% better, not 50% better, just try to be 1% better than you were the practice before. Well, come to think of it, that's great spiritual advice too, isn't it? That's great spiritual advice. No matter where you are in your walk with Christ, Jesus is calling each of us to just a little bit greater faith, to just have just a little more trust in him, just a little bit more, just 1% more faith in him today than you had yesterday. Brothers and sisters, why not pray together this week on the ground? Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. Help my unbelief.